From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Today, we'll learn how CCAP can be used as a useful and harmful tool for people in Wisconsin. Then we'll hear from a former Wisconsin Supreme Court justice about the influence money has on the court.
Now we have a situation where we have judges receiving millions and millions of dollars from special interests. And, people from all over the country. I mean, it's not even people from Wisconsin.
Plus, we'll look at how sports betting has changed in Wisconsin and its impact.
What we do see is in states that have legalized, in particular, online sports betting, there have been some negative impacts, particularly concentrated among lower income households.
All that's coming up on Lake Effect, but first, here are today's headlines. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Thanks for joining us today. It is National Sunshine Week, which advocates for the rights of citizens to access public records. That includes everything from open records and requests on your elected officials to figuring out salaries of public servants. These records exist to provide transparency, and while that might seem like a positive thing, it's not always used that way. WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez brings us a story about one of Wisconsin's most widely used public records, CCAP.
CCAP, better known as CCAP, some of the most important letters in the state of Wisconsin. Consolidated Court Automation Programs gives anyone with a computer or phone the ability to look up personal court records. It's almost a coming-of-age story for most of us. Who was the first person you CCAP'd? What did you find? And we're talking about it now because it is National Sunshine Week, which promotes the right to public access to government records at all levels. And that includes your neighbors, friends, families, and exes.
For a number of years, I used to work at different law firms. And at work, we would use CCAP on a pretty regular basis for different things. And that's how I first became aware of it. And once I knew about it, I started looking up all different kinds of people in my life just out of curiosity. And there were some surprises.
I have found out many interesting things through CCAP, such as one person who was becoming stalkerish actually had a history of restraining orders. And even as crazy as one person that I dated for over a decade on and off had gotten married in the last couple of years and not shared that with me.
Then when I was single and dating, I would look up potential dates as part of my vetting process whenever I would meet someone. Soon I became the person who all my friends would send their potential dates information to, and I would look them up as well and report back.
So I've used CCAP to look up myself to see if anybody has filed anything against me or how my other court cases were going for speeding tickets, if there was anything on there for when I applied for a job. Since I am in the criminal justice field, just like to know what would possibly show up on my background.
So pre-COVID, I was managing a bar on the east side and we had a regular who came in like clockwork. This was during the first Trump term, and this regular constantly brought up politics and race issues with an opinion that differed from most of the clientele and the staff. After talking to some downtown bar workers and learned he trolled people at other bars too, following an incident at my bar, I decided to ban him. I did it politely and before he entered the bar one day. Months later, I received a restraining order against myself from him. I had zero desire to interact with him at all, but now have a pending restraining order on my CCAP, which makes it kind of hard to date, among other things. The situation was taken care of and I no longer look like a creep. This was some wild blowback for banning a racist.
So my name is Gilbert Malice. I'm with Legal Aid Society of Milwaukee. I'm an attorney here, and I'm handling the eviction sealing clinic that we run monthly every second Wednesday of the month.
Legal Aid offers a sealing clinic for people looking to seal up past records that may pop up on CCAP, specifically evictions. The service can save someone a few $100s in court costs, but an untold amount of money in securing safe housing if they can improve their public record. I'm talking to Gil today to learn some more about the clinic, the ways CCAP affects people, and to learn a little bit more about myself. All right, Gil. So I'm here, and we're going to run a CCAP on me and see if I have any housing history I should be aware of or any eviction history.
We're going to see everything in Milwaukee County court system. So what is your last name?
Gutierrez.
All right, so we're just going to take a search. All right, so it looks like one thing came up, but...
All right, so I can explain. It's actually pretty simple advice now. Don't co-sign anything when you're young. But even though this case showed up on my record, that doesn't mean it's active.
The court in 2010 did say, as to you, this action was dismissed. Okay. So you have no involvement anymore. It's dismissed as to you. There's no judgment against you. But when someone searches your name, this record still shows up. Okay. So unless someone scrolls down and reads through these lines here and finds within this text of legalese what happened, who appeared, what happened, and it says that as to Gutierrez, the action is dismissed, they won't know that.
Going over this CCAP journey, I was relieved to hear this, but I was also really frustrated that this is showing up on my record. So when you're talking with folks, when people come up to you, what do you look for when you pop up their CCAP?
So we check for eviction records first. If they don't have any eviction records, great. They were either sealed or they didn't have an eviction. We look for the case. In an eviction case, we'll look at it, check the case code. It's a small claims eviction case, that the case is closed. If it's ongoing, they still have court, they still have things they need to do. Legal aid may be able to help them with that, but in this particular clinic, we look that it's closed. And then we, first and foremost, look, is there a judgment? The judgment is a signifier of, was there something bad that had happened in the case? If something bad happened, they owe some money. The judge right now says, hey, we're not going to seal it. If we don't see any of that, then I start going through the details of the case. What happened? Did it get dismissed? Is it dismissed in part? Who's it against? Make sure that it all fits with the person I'm talking to. And when I can confirm that the case is dismissed, I can confirm that the person didn't have an eviction granted against them, they weren't removed from their home, they had an agreement maybe. Did they complete that agreement? Then I can assist them with filling out the paperwork to request that this eviction be redacted as to their name. It just says, we're going to take your name off of CCAP, so when it's searched, that record doesn't show up.
How do you see CCAP used in eviction processes within landlords and tenants, right? Is it usually like weaponized or utilized?
So from my standpoint, I am a tenant defense attorney. I only see it from the defendant side of when they have the eviction filed, what they're trying to do to find new housing. I see it as weaponized. I know that it is a tool to search records, but that tool is used against a lot of people. When I first started doing volunteering for eviction defense, when I was in law school, we saw a lot of landlords search CCAP, use CCAP to say, was there an eviction granted against you? Not did you have one filed, not did you have an eviction record at all, but were you evicted from the home? And the answer would be, well, no, I moved out, I resolved it. The eviction record on CCAP would say dismissed, and that would stay on their record for 10 years. But it was dismissed, they'd find new housing. In the past 6 or 7 years, we've seen a shift where if the eviction has been filed, landlords will say, look, we need double security deposit, you're a risk. Whether it's granted, whether it was resolved or not. And lately, we've seen that if you have any evictions filed, we will not rent you. It's on websites for landlords. If you search for applications, it'll say no evictions, no eviction filings. So we get a lot of people saying, look, I have these old evictions, they're on my record, they were dismissed, I've had payment plans, I've resolved them, but it's still impacting my ability to find housing. That's when we look at the CCAP sealing and redaction.
And how long do things stay on people's records too?
So if there's a judgment that was granted, they owe some money, that can stay on the record for up to 20 years until it's either paid, waived, or discharged. If there's a dismissed eviction, so there's no judgment, no money owed, they weren't evicted, that will only stay on their CCAP record for 2 years. It used to be 10, but they did change it. We have asked for it to be shorter than 2 years, but even 2 years can pose a significant barrier to people finding housing.
Okay, going to jump in right here because what we're talking about is potential housing discrimination. But that's not the only way that CCAP can be used and has been used to discriminate. It's also affected people looking for work.
There are plenty of cases where when you search on CCAP, it comes up and it says this case has not been concluded, this case has been convicted, not convicted, and it says notice to employers. If you want to look, I do have a case that I can pull up that's okay. It just says, and notice it may be a violation of state law to discriminate against a job applicant because of an arrest or conviction record. Landlords still use this. We know that for evictions. Anyone can search CCAP. You don't need a law degree. You don't need anything. You can just punch someone's name in, look at it, see a case come up, and you don't have to care what's happening with the case. But the fact that there's something on CCAP says that they were sued, they were arrested potentially. There's fines, fees, something. With all of that information, they can say, well, maybe we don't want to hire this person, even if it's 5, 10, 20 years ago, right?
The last question is just your general thoughts on CCAP. Not good, not bad, nuanced.
It is very nuanced because CCAP is a tool, and tools can be used very well. Without having to go to the courthouse, without having to find records, it makes my job very easy. I get to just sit behind a laptop, and when someone comes to me and say, hey, I'm looking for help on this, I can pull it up and get a general understanding of what's going on. But then when they have personal questions about, well, what happened at this date, this time, what does this document say? I can't review that without going to the courthouse. So there's the good, the bad. But when it comes down to someone searching CCAP, using that name, finding something, and just jumping with that, making conclusions, making assumptions, it gets very difficult, and it can be weaponized and used against people. And usually, in my experience, that is used against the poor and underprivileged. It is used against people who, through no fault of their own, have circumstances that lead to this, whether it's convictions, whether it's evictions, whether it's even money claims. And with all of that, you don't get the details of what's actually happening. You make those assumptions, you use it against that person, and now it leads to a whole load of issues for them that just continues that cycle.
That was legal aid attorney Gil Malice. He spoke with WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez about CCAP. Season 2 of Swing State of the Union is here, and this time we're looking at the Wisconsin Supreme Court. This season explores how court races have changed over the past 30 years, and why this supposedly nonpartisan election feels so partisan. The 4th episode, Ethics versus Money, is out now. The episode explores how Supreme Court campaigns have become so expensive, and how justices set their own ethical standards. Producers Joy Powers and Sam Woods spoke with former Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Janine Geske about the influence of money on court campaigns and the ethical questions these funds raise. She begins by explaining the connection between campaign finance and partisan polarization.
The way I like to explain all this is I think you have to back up a little bit. And when I talk to the public, I'll say, you want to know why courts are important? Look at these 3 cases, because these 3 U.S. Supreme Court cases have deeply influenced what's happened. The first was Citizens United, which is a case that people know a lot about, and money is speech and corporations are people, and it's clear how I feel about that case. And then another case that came along was the Republican Party versus White, I think the name was, out of Minnesota. And it used to be, we all had a sense that ethically, we could not say to people, this is how I'm going to vote on a case. Or you didn't even want to infer that this is how you're going to vote on a case. Well, this case of Republican Party, it's interesting, the Republicans brought it, versus White, involved the state of Minnesota that had ethical prohibitions for judicial candidates to talk about where they are on cases or on issues that might come before the court. And the United States Supreme Court, and I know that Justice Alito, I don't know if he wrote the opinion, but he certainly wrote in the opinion that I think the public ought to know where people are on the court. And they held that it's a First Amendment right of candidates to talk about where they are on the court. The reason that case becomes important is for people like me who were not politically involved, who didn't take public stands on lots of issues, there was nothing I was carrying into my race that would say, oh, she's going to do this or she's going to do that. What happens when candidates start doing that is people think it's just like their legislator coming in and saying, this is how I'm going to vote if that issue comes before the legislature. You got my vote. The last case that came up is a case that our court, unfortunately, has pretty well ignored. A number of things were happening because of all the money that was coming into these races. It began with the League of Women Voters filing a petition with the court, asking the court to set limits on what a judicial candidate could receive when they're ultimately elected and sit on a case. And if a judicial candidate who became a judge had taken $1,000 from a party or from a lawyer on a case, they had to recuse themselves. And the court, uncharacteristically of past approaches, which I could describe, didn't consider it, they had no discussion, said absolutely not. And we're adopting the Wisconsin manufacturer's proposed rule, which says nothing about donations, but actually says a campaign contribution is not reason alone to recuse yourself off a case. Most states didn't go that far. We just said campaign contributions don't matter. Now, the third U.S. Supreme Court, it was Caperton, and in that case, a justice out of West Virginia had been running. He took a $3 million contribution from a company, and then he was elected, and he sat on a case involving that company that had lost a $50 million case, and he ruled for the company. And that went to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finally said, well, when it's this much and it's so direct, this goes to due process. This has gone too far. Our court, in looking at campaign contributions, has not applied Caperton to anything, and we still have a rule that each judge makes their own decision based on the rules, and the rules say a campaign contributions are not enough to get off a case. So all those things were happening simultaneously when you ask how we got there. But those kinds of things were happening in part because of the pressures of certain groups in our community. And what the court should have done and would have historically done is appointed a blue ribbon panel of ethics experts from around the country to take a look at what was happening and make recommendations to the court. Now, a few years later, a group of us, 50-some judges, signed a petition before the Wisconsin Supreme Court, again asking for a rule about recusal and campaign contributions. And I think our limit was $10,000 contribution and up. I have to say, I was never wed to the amount. I was wed to the idea that we ought to be looking and doing something about these campaign contributions. The court, again, shut down that petition, did nothing, did not appoint a blue ribbon panel, and said we're sticking with what we have. And so now we have a situation where we have judges receiving millions and millions of dollars from special interests, and people from all over the country. I mean, it's not even people from Wisconsin.
As you mentioned, you signed a petition in 2017 asking for stricter recusal rules. It seems like not much has happened since then. Do you see any desire from the Supreme Court to enact stricter rules?
I do think there are people on that court, and frankly, even judicial candidates who run, who'd be interested in doing that. The problem we have is now we have justices and judges who've received millions of dollars from special interest groups. And so what are they going to do when a case comes in front of them if they have a rule that says if you got over $10,000, you can't sit on the case? It's a dilemma for them. And I don't know what the answer is. I've been sort of battling in my head. The other problem we have in Wisconsin, which is not a problem in some states, is that the only people who can sit on a case at the Wisconsin Supreme Court are duly elected Wisconsin Supreme Court justices. So when somebody recuses themselves, you can't replace them. Some states allow a Court of Appeals judge or a retired judge to be placed in there, so you still have an uneven number. But we've seen already some cases at the court where somebody recuses themselves and the decision is 3-3, which means there's no decision. So I think probably, I'm trying to brainstorm in my head how they could do this. And I think they almost have to adopt a rule and say it's not retroactive. Starting now, if you receive a campaign contribution in excess, whatever the number is, you cannot sit on the case. They're both getting huge amounts of money from political parties and from special interest groups who frequently appear before the court. That's the problem.
I think it is fair to be skeptical that a justice can be impartial on a case that might benefit someone who contributed to that justice's campaign, and yet we have a system where justices are allowed to decide for themselves whether they can be impartial. Is this because the current system benefits justices and the special interest groups and political parties that donate to their campaigns, or is there something more going on behind the scenes that we can't see?
We can't change what the U.S. Supreme Court has done unless you do a constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So, I mean, I know there are groups working towards that to try to have Citizens United changed in a constitutional amendment. But short of that, all we can do is make certain behavior by judges unethical. And that's where the concentration is on this issue. And in theory, if I have somebody I really like being elected to the court, and I have a lot of cases in front of that court, and I know if I give more than X amount of dollars to that judge won't be able to sit on the case, I'm not going to give that money. I'd rather that judge hear my case than throw them off. So in theory, that ought to reduce those amounts. But ultimately, it's up to the judicial candidate. You know, I remember when I was running for election, I did receive like a $2,500 check from a lawyer who had a case in front of the court. And I saw it. I mean, I looked at all those numbers and I sent it back to him at the time. You know, I don't want to be receiving any money from anybody who has anything in front of the court. But there's another argument, and I will tell you what Justice Kelly would argue about why you can't do this. And his argument, and it has some merit, is that you're worried about influence of money. But how does money that's been used against you influence you in reaching a decision? So if I've had, well, let's say the Democratic Party and pro-choice people giving me millions and millions of dollars and attacking me because I'm in the other part of the race, and attacking me and attacking my family and putting out lies as I see it, there's a risk that I'm never going to rule anything for them because what they did to me during my race. And I do think that that is part of something that's going on. What happens is these candidates become pretty nasty to each other. And I don't know how you control all that. I mean, that's very complicated.
So we've seen Wisconsin Supreme Court campaigns get more expensive gradually over about 20 years and then exploding in 2023. How do you think this affects the legitimacy of the court in the eyes of voters?
I think it has a huge negative impact on people's sense that the court is truly impartial and fair. And I will blame the media in part. They never talk about any of these justices without liberal or conservative in front of their names. And I understand why they do that, but it doesn't help any because people think that's how the votes are. I think people don't like all the money, are worried about the money, and they're worried about what the money buys. People get so sick of those ads that are pounding on those judges. I mean, it's, you know, the harm they do to those judges and their families. I know a lot of lawyers and judges who would have made excellent Supreme Court judges that will not go anywhere near running for office because of what happens in those races. So that's another ripple effect, is we lose really, really good candidates and judges and lawyers who might make excellent justices who are not going to run. And I, you know, in this atmosphere, I would have had a hard time applying for a position, because I think it's almost impossible to run right now. If you're going to just say, I'm not going to talk about the cases and I'm going to be fair and impartial, and you've got all this money being poured into the other side, I think you're not going to have a chance. But it does go to the heart of the fairness and impartiality. And if people don't have faith in the decisions, we've lost our system. Because that's what the courts have, is people having faith in that third branch of government to be independent. And if we're not independent, then we are like a lot of other countries where the other branches of the government really control what happens.
Janine Geske is a former Wisconsin Supreme Court justice who left the court in 1998. She spoke with Joy Powers and Sam Woods for WUWM's podcast, Swing State of the Union. The first 4 episodes of Season 2 are available now, and you can find those at WUWM.com and wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every Wednesday leading up to the April general election. You can also hear it tomorrow at noon, right here on WUWM. Just like Swing State of the Union, Lake Effect is also a podcast. Search for Lake Effect wherever you get your podcasts to download and listen to us on demand. In about 10 minutes, we'll bring you our latest Bubbler Talk, which explores the mystery behind carved wood art appearing on trails in our area. But first, we'll look at how sports betting works in Wisconsin. Keep listening to Lake Effect on WUWM. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Today kicks off March Madness, NCAA's college basketball tournament, one of the biggest sporting events of the year. And with it comes lots of sports betting. Sports betting is now legal across much of the U.S. WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez shares the story of the NCAA tournament, the rise of sports betting, and the impact it's having in Wisconsin.
I've been studying sports gambling for a long time, but I've been finding it that people are more forthcoming about this, about their gaming practices now that it has been legalized.
Jason Quito Lopez is an assistant professor at UW-Madison. He spends a lot of time researching gaming like fantasy sports and sports betting. And that's a whole lot to study since 2018, when the U.S. Supreme Court called the federal ban on sports gambling unconstitutional.
Here's the tricky part about all of this is that the federal legalization of sports betting just meant that every state gets to decide whether and how to allow sports betting.
So far, 38 states, including Wisconsin, have legalized some form of sports betting. Here, it's only offered on tribal lands, but in other states, you might be able to bet online. And in others, you may have both options. But even though it's legal now, doesn't mean that it hasn't been happening before, especially when it comes to what Jason Lopez calls one of the biggest sports betting events of the year.
If they can get it. Under 10. Back door. Defense. Tough shot. 3 on the shot clock. Reynolds. Oh, goodness. Against the 3 seconds at midcourt. Jenkins gives it to Jenkins for the championship.
Gambling has always been a part of sports betting cultures, like all the way back to like the development of the March Madness NCAA tournament and the NIT tournament. People were making bets on those two tournaments. And one of the reasons why the NCAA tournament is more popular than the NIT, that story has to do with gambling.
The NIT, or the National Invitational Tournament, started way back in 1938 with just 6 teams. And a year later, the NCAA sees this idea and replicates it. Discussions around the sports world centered on which tournament was better, which one deserved more attention. And Lopez says it was the NIT that most agreed was the more prestigious of the two.
That changed when there were some pretty bad gambling scandals that happened around the NIT, around New York, and around Madison Square Garden. And that shifted the perception of the NIT as a entertainment sports product, and instead is something that might have scandals around it, that might be fixed. The NCAA used this problem with the NIT to try to like advertise itself as a clean end of the year tournament, and it worked.
The thing is, while the NCAA tournament is synonymous with college sports, it's also synonymous with sports betting. Maybe you've never watched a college basketball game, but you might have filled out a March Madness bracket.
My work shows that like gambling was a very, very, and has been always a very common way to engage with sports.
I usually do one safe bet. This is all in quotations because obviously no bet is safe, but I'll take teams that are supposed to win, string 2 or 3 of those together, and they'll usually hit.
This is Brian Gutierrez. And if that last name sounds familiar, it's because he is my brother. And over the past few years, he has been betting on sports a lot. But he says he's learned a few things.
When you get on a hot streak, don't start going crazy. I bought my little winter beater truck that I got, $3,000 all cash, nothing but betting money. But post truck, I got up to like another $1,600 in a couple weeks. But then I started going crazy and doing like $300 bets, and I started losing. So betting is, you get hot and cold.
Brian's in Milwaukee, which means that the only place he can go to wager on sports is at Potawatomi Casino. Their sportsbook opened last year, and walking in feels like you've just entered an IMAX theater playing nothing but sports. It is massive.
Just the sheer scale of Pato, and you see the amount of people in there. And then if you spend more time in there, you kind of see like how much other people are gambling and whatnot. Just the amount of money that flows through that place every day has got to be an insane amount.
My name is Mark Sommerhauser. I'm communications director with the Wisconsin Policy Forum and also was lead author of our recent report on sports betting.
Last month, Mark and his team authored a study looking at the impacts of sports betting in the state, and that includes finances.
Over time, the annual amounts of the payments that the tribes remit to the state essentially as a condition of their compacts. So these tribes, sort of in exchange for being given the exclusive right to conduct these games a chance, they do make these payments to the state, which are used for all kinds of different things.
Basically, the state and tribes have an agreement. You can set up shop, be the only game in town, and pay a kind of tax back to the state.
Those payments are fairly stable in those pre-pandemic years. Then they go off a cliff, basically. By 2022, they rebound pretty well, and then they're up over significantly higher levels here in 2023 and 24.
Last year, Potawatomi won a record more than $400 million from gamblers, and over $66 million of that went back to the state.
They do go to support services for tribal members, but there also are a significant number of areas where they make payments both to the state, but also to the local governments in Milwaukee, City of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County, to support some of the services that the city and county provides. So that is a really significant thing, and actually not the case in every place that we looked. In a lot of other parts of the country, these payments are just going to the state.
The sports betting study touched on another part of the equation: societal impacts. Like what happens in places where online betting is legal or anything goes.
Really, 2024 was like the first year when we saw a lot of academic research becoming available, because outside of the state of Nevada, it hasn't been broadly legal in very many places for very long. And, I would say the research definitely, I think, raises several notes of caution and concern. What we do see is in states that have legalized, in particular, online sports betting, there have been some negative impacts, particularly concentrated among lower income households. We do cite in the report the one paper in particular that found that in states that legalized, I believe it was online betting throughout the entire state, increased rates of bankruptcy, increased rates of debt sent to collections, debt consolidation loans, auto loan delinquency. So these are serious impacts, that clearly are not affecting by any means a majority or even a large share of the people who occasionally participate in sports betting. But what we do see is that among a small subset of folks who engage in sports betting, that the negative consequences can be really serious.
There are safeguards in the state that prohibit all-out gambling written into the state's constitution. Remember, as of now, the only place you can make a wager on games is inside of a tribal nation casino. But in this world, things change faster than the luck of a Cinderella team.
All right, let's say you're filling out your bracket to predict the future of sports betting in Wisconsin. And we're talking about things staying the same as they are right now, where you can only gamble on tribal lands and maybe an online option, or full bore, everything goes, everything is legal. Who's the favorite? Who's the underdog? And who are the people cheering for?
That's a great question. So I want to be careful here, because I know my employer does not want me to get too deep into the prognostication game. I would be surprised. The one thing I would say there is I would be surprised if Wisconsin went full bore, everything legal in the near future.
Mark says these kind of big overhaul changes would take time and infrastructure, and tribal nations would probably push back a whole bunch. At the same time, sports betting is ubiquitous. Sports media is drowning in betting ads. There are prop bets, future bets, parlays, words that I just learned featured in the most popular morning TV sports segments. If you watch local sports teams like the Milwaukee Bucks, you've noticed that the home broadcasting station is run by FanDuel, an online sportsbook. And sports leagues like the NFL are pushing gambling services to their fans. Jason Quito Lopez says this is all part of the plan.
Obviously, sports leagues and the NCAA, they try to keep some distance between themselves and gambling because, like we were just talking about, they don't want fixing scandals or even the appearance of fixing scandals because that harms their entertainment product. However, gambling and fantasy and March Madness brackets are really good for business because they deepen engagement and they encourage engagement with the sports products that they're offering. So all American sports leagues are in this kind of like double bind of wanting to try to like keep some distance from gaming and gambling, but also encourage it so that people will kind of like get into their sports more. So they always have had, ever since again, like all the way back to the beginning, they've always had this ambivalent relationship to gaming and gambling.
That was Jason Quito Lopez, an assistant professor at UW-Madison, and Mark Sommerhauser from the Wisconsin Policy Forum, speaking with WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez about sports betting.
Bubbler Talk, quenching Milwaukee's thirst for knowledge.
I'm WUWM's Excaret Nunez. In this Bubbler Talk, we're setting out to solve a mystery. Laurel Heapch has been hiking Milwaukee County's Oakleaf Trail since the start of the pandemic, when something caught her eye, and she decided to ask Bubbler Talk.
I noticed these little wood carved birds, and I'm just wondering who makes those and puts those up.
I was determined to find out. Heapch says the wooden birds can usually be found nailed to bridges and rails along the Menominee line of the Oakleaf Trail. They have a folk art vibe and vary in size, usually between 2 to 3 inches long and 4 to 5 inches wide. The body, beak, tail, and eye are each painted a different color. The Oakleaf Trail is managed by Milwaukee County Parks. I thought they must know the artist making these birds. So I reached out to their trails coordinator, Jacob Sanchez, and asked. So I was wondering if you know who the artist behind these wooden birds might be.
I don't. It's a mystery that me and my team have been aware of for some time, but we do not know who makes the birds.
Bummer. This wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. Next, I turned to the people of Milwaukee Reddit for help. I posted pictures of the birds and asked if anyone knew the artist. There were lots of opinions, but still no answers.
Some mysteries are best left unsolved.
I've wondered that too. I've seen them on the trail near Hartung Park.
If the artist finds this thread, I want them to know how charming I find those little wooden birds.
In my search for Milwaukee's Banksy, I reversed image searched pictures of the wooden birds, looked up Wisconsin artists on Etsy, and reached out to local Milwaukee art groups. It still didn't lead me to the artist. That's when my research led me to stumble upon Jo Jensen. While she isn't the Milwaukee artist, she is a Madison artist. She's known for her artwork that uses pull tabs, but most recently she's gotten attention for making wooden birds for her neighborhood. Her wooden birds are a little more realistic looking than the mystery birds in Milwaukee.
People's motivations for making things are as diverse as the stuff that they make.
I thought she might be able to help me understand the mind of the mystery artist making the wooden birds in Milwaukee.
Because they made them and they left them in public places, I think they're trying to get people to notice birds, to be conscious of the world around you, the living things around you, maybe.
She describes this form of art as guerrilla art.
Putting something without asking, and something that could be considered as permanent, or changing the color of something, or attaching something to something else. You know, one person might say, oh, that's lovely. Another person says you're defacing public property. So I understand why the bird person in Milwaukee is keeping it quiet, because you have two sides of the coin.
But the mystery artist does not need to fret. Milwaukee County Park staff are huge fans. Here's Sanchez, the trails coordinator.
They're benign. They're kind of fun. They're whimsical. They're not hurting anyone, and they add a little freshness to the trail. And especially in these shoulder seasons like we have now, when all the plants are dead, it's fun to see a pop of color on the trail.
Back on the Oakleaf Trail, Bubbler Talk listener Laurel Heapch and I met up at Hart Park in Wauwatosa to find the wooden birds together.
Oh, yeah. Look at that. This one's not even a bird. That's exciting. This one's a fish.
She said she'd love for the artist to make a map of where to find the birds to draw more people to the trails, but thinks it might be best for this case to remain unsolved.
Maybe it would be better to just keep them a mystery. Just know that somebody out there is thinking about the hikers and bikers and wants to bring a little happiness to people's lives.
In the meantime, keep your eyes peeled and enjoy the scavenger hunt. You never know what you might find in nature.
What have you always wanted to know about the Milwaukee area?
Visit wuwm.com/bubblertalk to submit your question. And join us April 10th at Gathering Place Brewing Company in River West for Bubbler Talk Trivia. Register to attend at wuwm.com.
We'll take one more break, then learn about a Wisconsin pet turned World War II veteran and a children's book all about his life. That's coming up on Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. During World War II, American families were asked to make a lot of sacrifices. Americans rationed everything from food and clothing to gas and firewood. Some families were even asked to donate their pets to the war effort for the Dogs for Defense program. The military deployed family pets to the front lines to help soldiers on the battlefield, including a little dog named Brownie from King, Wisconsin. His life story is the subject of a children's book called Brownie the War Dog, written by Kelly Nelson. He joins Lake Effect's Joy Powers to talk about it.
One of the most fascinating things about this book is this little-known program it discusses, where Americans were encouraged to enlist their pets. Can you tell us a bit about it?
I'd be glad to. So, the Dogs for Defense program was very unique. It was a civilian based program that was started by dog enthusiasts, and they started to think that maybe that there was a skill set with dogs, and especially in the obedience world, and things that they thought might marry well with the military and what they could use the dogs for as far as war use. So it was a very unique time, and they really reached out to folks on the home front, including children. And this included them asking for family pets to be donated to service in the war. And there were regional recruiters. There was one in Milwaukee that we know of. And at that time, this was new. This was a new use for World War II. So they relied on recruiting the family pets.
Now, I was a bit familiar with the Army and the Navy using cats, for pest control and that kind of thing on ships and in storage facilities, but I was less aware of exactly what dogs were being enlisted to do. What were the kinds of jobs that a dog would perform during the war?
Sure. So there was a variety of tasks that they had really enlisted them for. Many were sentry dogs, which Brownie was a sentry dog, basically a guard dog, and it was guarding artillery. It was guarding the men. A handler was assigned, and that individual handler exclusively handled the war dog, and it was not a pet anymore. It was trained to be an attack dog, and even the other soldiers didn't get close. It was something that was it was a tool, and it was a tool that was very much used for protection. Other dogs that were more like a husky and those kind of breeds, Malamutes, they were used for pulling sleds in different regions. Some dogs were used as messenger dogs to relay messages to soldiers. So a variety of uses. And they did have to have specific height requirements, weight requirements. These were not jobs that were suited for small dogs. They had to have some girth to them.
Do we know about how many dogs ended up serving in World War II for the U.S. Army?
The U.S. Military in general had asked for about 200,000. That was what their goal was. They wanted purebreds, but at that time in our country, there were not a lot of purebreds, and so they had to widen their net as far as reaching out to crossbreeds and things, shepherd mixes, Dobermans. But about 20,000 dogs were donated, with about 10,000 of those making the cut. Many of the dogs were afraid of noises, and that seemed to be the biggest problem, that the dogs were put in situations where they just shut down because of the noises. So they became very particular as far as who they approved to be in the War Dog program. And much of it was based again on the size, but also their ability to withstand the noises.
Sure. A lot of noise during war, I would imagine, and a lot of different requirements as far as temperament, as far as ability to do the job, as you say. What made a dog like Brownie a good candidate for the war?
I think really the trainability, the youth, they had to be young dogs, they had to be trainable. The main thing being that they had to be quiet. Even in if you follow any dog obedience, as you get into the upper ranks, a lot of the dog training is done with hand signals, and these dogs had to learn to be quiet. These dogs really had to learn to watch their handlers because everything was given with either hand signals or by body language, and they had to learn to be very quiet. So really, I think just the willingness and trainability was the main thing as far as the success of the dogs.
So, for Brownie, what was that journey like from being a house pet into being on the front lines with all of the other soldiers?
Right. So he was sent from Wapaka, Wisconsin. He was sent to the Fort Robinson Dog Receiving and Training Center out in Nebraska. And that's where veterinarians, they did, they had an initial physical to make sure he passed physical requirements. And then that's when intense training started. And a big part of that was assigning a handler, having that handler be the exclusive person to feed him, groom him, train him. And it was a very intense training process that they needed to go through, and again, much of it being for the dog to learn to be quiet, and really follow and watch his handler so that they were ready to be shipped over to the Pacific Theater in Brownie's case in order to do the job to keep his handler safe and his unit safe.
Now, once he was out there, what was Brownie doing?
So he was a sentry dog. So he a variety of tasks. It was really to be a protector for his handler, for his unit. In any capacity, he was always being asked to sniff out the enemy, and these were in very very intense circumstances. The Pacific Theater really refers to the islands. There was a lot of battling that was going on where they had to hop from island to island, and this also included the monsoon season in more of the spring and June time of the year. And Brownie was there for about a year and a half, so he would have withstood this where it just rained constantly. And these were jungles that so just really awful conditions. Sometimes it was shoulder deep in water that the dogs had to wade through. So really, really miserable circumstances. But he did his job and he did it well.
Now, of course, World War II had many casualties, and I was surprised to learn that a little dog like Brownie was able to survive the war. He came back, but like many veterans, he had changed quite a bit. How did Brownie live out the rest of his days after the war?
Sure. So after the war, he did go through a demilitarization process. He went back to the Fort Robinson Training Center, and they basically civilianize these dogs to so that they would be able to function within just regular civilian circumstances. He was sent back to his family. Families did have the option of bringing the dog home to them, and they had to accept them no matter what the circumstance was. But Brownie had a wonderful temperament. He switched right back. He made the transition back from a fierce fighting sentry dog to that of a family dog, and he began to follow Orrin, his young owner's mother, who was a cook at the home at the Wisconsin Veterans Home at King. She was a cook there, and he began to accompany her. He'd escort her to work every day, and then when she went in, then he'd make his rounds and visited all the veterans, and really became quite beloved by the veterans and their families. And everyone was devastated when he was hit by a car and killed. But he did live out the remainder of his years really in service to man in just a different fashion. He served while he was overseas, and he served man when he came back. So I think when I learned of his story, I just thought it was the most endearing thing that this animal just really his whole life was in service to people.
For sure. Now, of course, this is a fairly serious topic, and the book is for kids. What do you hope kids get from reading this?
I hope that they have a real understanding of the sacrifices that were made on the home front during World War II from the families, from the children. I hope that they also had a real appreciation for this canine hero who is from Wisconsin, who is buried here 75 years ago. 2024 marks the 75th anniversary of his passing and military funeral. But it pleased me just so much that the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, who published this book, felt the same way that I did as far as that his story deserved to be preserved and shared in this fashion and in such a beautiful picture book format. So there are just so many things that I hope that children take away from this. but mostly just to have that appreciation of the sacrifice that was made.
Well, Kelly, thank you so much for joining us here on Lake Effect and sharing your work.
Thank you for having me.
Kelly Nelson is the author of Brownie the War Dog. He spoke with Lake Effect's Joy Powers. And that's Lake Effect for today. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Joy Powers, Sam Woods, and Excrit Nunez join me in producing Lake Effect each week with help from Rob Larry and Graham Thomas. Becky Mortensen is our executive producer. Emily Files helps edit the show. We also heard from Jimmy Gutierrez, Eddie Morales, Susan Bentz, and Catherine Kokel from the WUWM News team this week. Jason Reevy is our studio engineer. Michelle Maternowski is our digital manager. Valeria Navarra-Viegas is our digital editor. Chopper Shep wrote our theme music. If you've missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at WUWM.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Join us again on Monday at noon for a new Capitol Notes where we'll look at the upcoming April 1st election. Thank you so much for joining us today, right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.